Hi everybody, it's Thorn. I'm thinking this video will be kind of short. I haven't posted one in a while and I was just sort of struck by an idea and I thought I would do what I always do and talk at the internet. So this morning, I don't even remember how this happened. Oh, I posted I'm moving, and I posted some pictures of bookshelves that I have assembled and lined with books in my new home. And I moved all of my religious studies books over. And I was just like, everybody loves book porn. I'm going to post some book porn. So I took pictures of my shelves and I was like, LOL, book porn, religious studies, whatever. And it turned into actually kind of a fun exchange between a few folks who have academic backgrounds about some of our favorite theorists. And then somebody asked, like, what contemporary philosophers have you read that have impacted your spiritual path? And it was just kind of cool because in magical spaces, occult spaces, witchcraft spaces, I feel like we don't do enough talking about writers in other disciplines. I've made videos in the past about like where are the advanced books and next step books. And one of the arguments that is really common, and I make myself, is in order to advance as a witch or whatever kind of occultist magical person you are, often when we're talking about reading, if we assume that reading is the way that you advance, which by itself is a problem, okay, but that's how we speak generally, and books are good, we all like books. Often in trying to advance as a witch, the answer is rarely to read more books about witchcraft. If you've read extensively already, you've probably noticed that most books cover a lot of the same things. They might do it from different angles or from the perspectives of different traditions. They might be aimed at slightly different audiences, but by and large, like, there are like a few distinct different kinds of witchcraft books, and then there are lots of books that are sort of like those books. And that's not a criticism necessarily. I think we have to sort of rewrite those ideas for new generations, new ways of thinking, new political climates, new social climates. Like, it's important that we revisit the same things over and over again. So I'm not knocking that. But as somebody who's seeking to become an advanced practitioner, reading 100 books like that is not what's going to get you there. So one of the things that I and lots of other folks say is you got to get out of the magical section of the bookstore or the library, and you've got to start looking at history or mythology or anthropology, religious studies, etc. Like, those are the books that really take you deeper. Again, aside from the actual practice of magic and witchcraft, which of course I think is the thing that we should be prioritizing. But if we're just talking about reading, it's important to get into other sections of the library, right? So one of those sections that we basically never talk about, and which is why I was so tickled this morning on Twitter, we don't talk about social theory, critical theory. And I think that's a shame because there's so much there that has been really beneficial for me as not even just a witch, but as kind of a magically minded, religiously minded person. And I'll give you some names here in a second. I don't want to super dwell. And I think the reason why, I think this is pretty just true. The reason why folks don't get so much into that material is because it tends to not be very accessible. It takes practice to read. Obviously, like, if you've been to a university, particularly if you've been to graduate school, like, you had mentors and teachers like teaching you how to read that stuff. And most people don't have access to that. So consequently, a lot of that philosophy, a lot of that social theory is beyond like the skill set that a lot of folks have. But it's something that you can practice and you can learn. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about like why that stuff is cool and how one might go about exploring it. So an example, I am a coven leader. if you've been around in my channel for a while, you know that I run a coven. And I'm involved in other communities too. Obviously, I'm an author, but I also go to events, and I'm in a position where I frequently find myself in a teacher role. And I don't want to dwell too much on like what that word means and what exactly kind of goes on in my head when I think about it, but that's a word that we use in our community. We talk about teaching, we talk about teachers, whether we're talking about a speaker at a conference or a festival, or we're talking about somebody writing a book or somebody leading a coven. And increasingly we're seeing books about leadership and teaching in pagan, magical, witchcraft communities. But there's this whole body of literature that I think folks don't necessarily turn to, specifically about education. So I'm of the mindset that if you want to learn to be a better coven leader, if you want to learn to be a better teacher, then it's not enough to just study lots of witchcraft or practice lots of witchcraft or read books about being a witch teacher or being a community leader. You have to actually read about teaching and leadership as distinct disciplines. So one writer for me that was really beneficial was bell hooks. And I started reading bell hooks in like when I was becoming a classroom teacher. That was my first exposure. And bell hooks was really helpful for me when I was trying to get my head around inclusivity as a coven leader. We talk a lot about inclusivity. I mean, not to say that we talk enough, we don't, okay? But usually when we have conversations about inclusivity in magical spaces, we focus on gender, we focus on sexuality. Like those are the things that are kind of at the fore right now. We don't talk a lot about accessibility in terms of education and locations of power. And bell hooks is very concerned with power dynamics in the classroom, and particularly focusing on racism, which of course is linked to classism, etc. And those are conversations that we don't have enough of in magical spaces. So I was really concerned at the time and continually about how do I structure my coven? How do I behave in such a way as a coven leader that I'm not excluding people who don't have access to particular kinds of educations? By which I mean, like, here's an example. One of the things that we do in traditional Wiccan communities is we give people reading lists. Like, somebody's interested in becoming a Wiccan, somebody's interested in being an initiate. Okay, here's a long-ass reading list. And sometimes those books are quite difficult. Like, it's not easy to sit down and read Gerald Gardner for all kinds of reasons. Like, he's not a great writer. We have to consider like books of the era, like linguistically they're just different. They can be harder for contemporary readers, etc. And we just have this baseline where we expect people, newcomers, to just be able to read these texts, to have access to them, to be able to afford them, to be able to process them and kind of engage with them in useful ways, unattended, unassisted. And like, that's a kind of exclusivity. And it's not the one that we talk about very often. And I found myself in a position as a coven leader where, like, wow, everybody in my coven has like a graduate degree. Like, isn't that convenient for me? But what does that say about how I'm doing Wicca, right? Like, am I really running things in such a way where we're going to be like this kind of elitist group? Because that's a problem. And the answer to solving that problem was not to read more books about Wicca. It was to look at education and accessibility and power in education as a whole, ergo bell hooks. So that was just an example. Other things that I found helpful, generally thinking about religion as a whole or power as a whole. We talked about Michel Foucault on Twitter. Foucault writes about power, agency, control, kind of why people, why societies and how societies are structured the way they are, and how individuals have access to power or do not within those societies. This was a really helpful way for thinking about why people make the kinds of choices they do, again, which leads to like why communities are structured the way they are, who's in power, who isn't, how do we maintain boundaries, how are people punished when they transgress. Like Foucault has a lot to say about that, and obviously Foucault is not writing about witchcraft, but a witch could read this sort of material and really expand their thinking about how those things work. Also mentioned Pierre Bourdieu, who does something really similar in thinking about how particularly ideas are passed around in society and how those things kind of limit how people think and what is it possible to even conceive of based on our experiences, the kinds of societies we're born into, etc. Just a really interesting way and a useful way of thinking about these broader categories. So instead of just learning about witchcraft or Wicca or something that's really narrow, thinking about how groups themselves are formed, or how societies structure themselves, how power works. So anyway, there's that. We also mentioned William James. I often refer to Emile Durkheim, who has a lot to say about the differences between religion and magic, and I think a lot of those ideas are useful today, even though they're not new ideas. Okay, there's just so much out there, and if you are in a position where you're thinking like, how do I take the next steps? What can I read? I really encourage you to think beyond the category of witchcraft or magic or the occult, and think more broadly about people and societies and how those things work, right? Like, don't just read books about, you know, gender and sexuality in witchcraft books. Read broadly about this, like this. I'm thinking like queer theory, and like there's so much out there that's outside of just our narrow kind of like our shelves on like in our homes and our libraries, right? Like we refer the same books over and over again, but I think our ideas are bigger than that, and there are so many other resources. So there's that. Not a super short video as I had intended. My upcoming book, The Witch's Path, it was sort of funny. I originally wasn't going to put a reading list in it just because kind of the whole premise of the book was most of us really don't need to just be reading more books to be better witches. We need to be practicing witchcraft. But I was really encouraged by my publisher to put in a reading list. And I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to put in a reading list, I'm going to get weird with it. And this is the kind of stuff that's in my reading list. So if you're curious, that book comes out in September. Please pre-order it. My cats are hungry. And I hope you all have a good day. Go read something.